I'm Abden Simmons. I've lived in Waldoboro pretty much all my life. I grew up here. I've dug clams since I was probably 8 years old, so off and on for 45 years. When I was in school during the summers, I'd have my parents drop me off, my grandmother pick me up and just go sell my clams or bring me home. I've always done it. I've always loved to do it. During the winter, I used to cut wood in the winter with my father. And I did that right out of high school too, cut wood in the winter. Everything would freeze up. We had winters back then. And in the 80s, late 80s, early 90s, we had winters back then where, everything would freeze up on the flats. So it made it tough, so I had to go do something else. And then I'd cut wood in the winter and go dig clams in the summer.
We used to have ice in the wintertime. We could walk on it, Usually the clams, when the ice went out, you see a lot of seed around. I don't know why, but it did seed in when there was ice around, and shellfish is it's really going downhill, and it has for a few years. My dad said it quite a few years ago, and I didn't believe him, but it's kind of disappearing on us. I don't know what it is about the shellfish, the clams. I wish I knew, but there's a lot of ideas out there, but they all point at the green crab situation, which it could be the green crabs, but I have a hard job believing it's a green crabs because my dad said years ago there was green crabs, right?
There was green crabs around. When I was a kid, there was all kinds of green crabs around, and we had a lot of clams. It was good clamming, better than it is now. It is one thing that's contributing to it, that's hurting it, but it's always been there. They've always been there, and they've always been getting some of the seed clams and stuff.
I've seen a decline in clams in areas. You also see them come back. It seems like they go always in a cycle. 7-year cycle. You have 3 or 4 good years, and then you have a couple, 2 or 3 bad years. And clams always seem to come back around. But I've seen a lot of changes on how people harvest product. We used to hoe dig everything, turn the mud, and the areas always got turned upside down, and the mud used to get aerated, and places for clams to settle in when they spawned out. They create a shell, and they would settle to the bottom and have places like little windrows to be able to fall into and get buried in the mud during the tide. When the tide would come in, it'd wash the mud over them and bury them for protection. But people have changed how they harvest clams now in the last probably several years, probably the last 10 years. They've gone to pulling clams out of the mud by hand, which doesn't aerate the mud, doesn't give the clams places to stay. The mud stays flat. When clams spawn and they seed out and the clam develops a shell, as soon as it hits the mud, it used to have a place to have a backstop and little eddies for clams to fall in. Now the mud's flat, so it just completely rolls across the mud and winds up on the shore, and that's where a lot of times you see clams now.
The mud is different than it was. The consistency is not the same. It's hard to describe, but it's not the same bottom as it was 40 years ago, I can tell you that. They've cleaned the ocean up so much. They've cleaned up all these houses are so close to the water. They've got all new systems in. There's no bacteria going into the water, very little. And I think it had a lot to do with the shellfish industry. You need bacteria for things to grow. Farmers put bacteria in their garden so it'll grow. And I'm a strong believer that the ocean needs that too, and I think they've cleaned it up way too much for the shellfish. I believe that's what it is.
Well, I think he's right, because a lot of areas that we dug years ago, now they're saying they're polluted and you can't go in them. You can't get in there and dig at all because it's polluted. And we always dug in, that's where we got our best clams. It was the best digging. And not only that, it seems that if you take an area and you say this is polluted, you can't dig it. Okay, we do a lot of work to get it open again, putting in sewer systems and everything. And you go back there and go dig, and what was theirs, they're gone. There's no clams there again. We had one area up here, Goose River, that they closed it for about 7 years. They said it was polluted, which it probably was something polluting it without doubt, but I think it was more animals than anything, than that was coming down the stream and going in that pond, that area. And once we got them to open it after a while by putting in some new sewer systems and stuff like that. And when we reopened it, there was nothing in there. And clams just died off because I think it's like you said, because I think it's cleaned it up too much. The bacteria was all gone. The feed was gone for them. And even today, it still hasn't come back. There's very few clams in there. And we used to be able to go in there and dig all summer long, get a good dig every day.
Another thing too is when they settle and they decide to go into the mud, if it hasn't been turned over, the mud gets acidic. And when the mud gets acidic, when a clam settles, he's very vulnerable. That shell is very soft, and when that acid gets to that shell, it just eats it up and the clam dies. So you don't have recruitment.
When they die, it really changes the consistency of the mud, you know, and we've had clams come in, you know, quite a few times, and they've died off. You take 3 years ago, we had a big set of seed that come in Friendship, you know, and the guys did good for a couple of years. Now it's gone again. It's totally gone. It never come back. I don't know what the situation is. I don't believe it's anything to a climate change, not one bit.
It's not necessarily climate change that we don't have clams up in the upper estuaries. We've done water samples all the whole length of the river down here in the Potomac, and it's not acidic. You know, we don't see that acidity up in the river, in the water, but it's in the mud. And those clams have a hard job surviving to fight that. So, you know, and changing how you harvest product is a big issue. And everyone says, well, why don't you just change to hoe digging only? Well, there's a handful of guys in the town that just don't know how to hoe dig. So do we, you know, say, well, sorry, too bad, you lose. Well, that's not how we operate. You know, we try to keep everybody employed. We're the biggest, Waldeboro's the biggest shellfish town in the state. We have the most licenses in the state as a single town. I believe it was 2015, the fall of 2015, one of the guys that's on the shellfish committee walked the whole length of one side of the river, never found a clam. You couldn't buy a clam. That following spring, there was 8 to 10 bushel digging in the same exact area. And I told a scientist that the clams just weren't showing. He says, it's not possible. It's not possible. It is possible. We saw it. It was living proof. You know, so scientists, and they really should be a harvester and try to make a living for a couple years to see how it is. You know, none of these guys that are making changes for my livelihood have done it for a living. We're getting to the point now with clamming that the scientists are starting to listen to us. It's actually starting to pay attention to what we say, because they're not seeing what we're seeing. So now they're learning. They need to take the fisherman's experience into account.